The autumn rain had stopped an hour ago, leaving the sidewalk outside the Meridian Grand Hotel slick and gleaming under the golden glow of ornate street lamps. Marcus Webb stood beneath the burgundy awning, water still dripping from its scalloped edge, his hands tucked into the pockets of a coat that had seen better years. The fabric, once a deep charcoal, had faded to something closer to ash, worn thin at the elbows and frayed along the hem. His jeans were clean but old, his boots scuffed leather that had walked more miles than most luxury cars had driven. He wasn't waiting for anything in particular, just standing, watching, the way he often did. Through the hotel's towering glass doors, he could see the lobby, a cathedral of marble and crystal, where chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks and well-dressed people moved with the unhurried confidence of those who'd never questioned their place in the world. A doorman in a pristine uniform held the entrance open for a couple in evening wear, the woman's laugh tinkling out into the night air like expensive wind chimes. Marcus let his gaze drift upward, tracing the building's facade. 18 stories of limestone and ambition, each window a golden square of warmth against the darkening sky. He knew every floor, every room, every corner where the original architect had cut costs that Marcus had later corrected. "Excuse me." The voice came from behind him, sharp, suspicious. Marcus didn't turn immediately. He'd learned long ago that sudden movements made certain people nervous. "Excuse me, sir." Now he turned slowly, his expression neutral. A security guard stood 3 feet away, one hand resting on his belt near his radio. The man was younger than Marcus, maybe 30, with shoulders that strained against his black uniform jacket and eyes that had already made their judgment. "Yes." Marcus's voice was quiet, measured. "You need to move along." The guard's tone left no room for discussion. "This is private property. No loitering." Marcus glanced at the sidewalk beneath his feet, then back at the guard. "I'm not loitering. I'm standing." "Yeah, well, you can't stand here." The guard took a half-step closer, his chest puffed slightly. "Guests have been complaining. You're making people uncomfortable." "I'm making people uncomfortable." Marcus repeated the words softly, not as a question but as something to hold up to the light and examine. "By standing. Look, I don't want any trouble." The guard's hand moved fractionally closer to his radio. "Just move on, all right? There's a shelter 3 blocks down on Jefferson. They serve dinner until 8. Something flickered in Marcus's chest. Not anger, but something older and more tired. He'd felt it before, this particular species of casual cruelty, dressed up as concern or protocol. The assumption that a black man in worn clothes couldn't possibly belong anywhere near this much marble and gold. "I don't need a shelter," Marcus said evenly. "Right?" The guard's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Listen, buddy, I get it. Times are tough. But you can't panhandle here. It's against city ordinance and hotel policy." "I'm not panhandling." "Then what are you doing?" Marcus considered the question. What was he doing? Standing in front of a building he owned, watching people enjoy a space he'd created, wearing the same coat he'd worn when he had nothing because he refused to forget what nothing felt like. "I'm just standing here," he said finally. The guard's eyes narrowed. Behind him, the hotel doors opened again, releasing a small crowd of guests onto the sidewalk. Marcus saw them notice him, the subtle shifts in posture, the way their conversations faltered, how they instinctively gave him a wider berth than necessary. A woman in a fur-trimmed coat clutched her handbag closer. A man in a tailored suit made deliberate eye contact with the security guard, his expression clearly communicating, "Handle this." "Look, I've been polite," the guard said, his voice rising now, playing to his audience. "But I'm telling you for the last time, move along or I'm calling the police." For standing on a public sidewalk? For trespassing and harassment. Marcus felt the weight of eyes on him. The small crowd had stopped at the curb, ostensibly waiting for their car service, but really watching, witnessing, some with open disdain, others with that particular kind of discomfort that came from watching injustice and choosing to do nothing about it. The hotel doors opened once more, and this time a man in a gray suit emerged, Jeffrey Hammond, the hotel's general manager. Marcus knew him well, though Hammond had never looked at Marcus long enough to remember his face. He was a man who saw only what he expected to see. "Trevor, what's going on here?" Hammond's voice carried the clipped authority of someone used to problems being solved before they reached his desk. "Just trying to clear away a vagrant, sir," Trevor the security guard said, standing straighter. "He's refusing to leave." Hammond's gaze swept over Marcus with the efficiency of a man cataloging inventory. Worn coat, old jeans, scuffed boots, black. The assessment took less than 2 seconds. "Sir," Hammond addressed Marcus with the kind of false courtesy that was really just condescension in a business suit. "I'm going to have to ask you to move along. This is a place of business, and we have every right to refuse service and remove solicitors from our property." "I haven't asked for service," Marcus said quietly, "and I'm not on your property. I'm on the sidewalk. You're loitering with clear intent to panhandle from our guests." Hammond pulled out his phone. "Now you can leave voluntarily, or I can have the police escort you. Your choice." The small crowd had grown larger. More guests had emerged, drawn by the confrontation like theatergoers to a stage. Marcus could feel their collective judgment pressing against him like a physical weight. In their eyes, he saw the same assumption repeated over and over. Dangerous, desperate, destitute. Not human in the way they were human, but something lesser, something to be removed like trash from a curb. "I'm not leaving," Marcus said, his voice still calm, though he could feel his heart beating harder now. Not from fear, but from the effort of maintaining his composure while being treated like refuse. Hammond's expression hardened. "Trevor, call the police, and make sure they understand we have a potentially aggressive vagrant refusing to comply with lawful orders." "Potentially aggressive," Marcus repeated softly. "Because I'm standing still. Because you're making threats and refusing to leave," Hammond said sharply, and Marcus understood the game being played. The narrative was being written in real time, and he was cast as the villain in his own humiliation. A woman from the crowd spoke up, middle-aged, diamonds at her throat, disgust on her perfectly made-up face. "This is absolutely unacceptable. We pay premium prices to stay here, and we shouldn't have to deal with this element. It's bad enough downtown, but in this neighborhood." "I completely agree, Mrs. Ashworth," Hammond said, his voice soothing. "I assure you, this situation is being handled." "This situation," Marcus said, and now there was an edge to his voice, subtle but present, "is a man standing peacefully on a public sidewalk. That's all." "That's not all," Hammond shot back. "You're intimidating guests. You're loitering with intent. And frankly, you look like you might be under the influence of something." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a threatening gesture, hadn't done anything but exist in a space where his existence was deemed inappropriate. "I'm completely sober," Marcus said. "We'll let the police determine that." Hammond was already dialing. "Yes, hello? I need to report a vagrant outside the Meridian Grand Hotel, corner of 5th and Ashland. He's refusing to leave and becoming increasingly aggressive." "Yes, I'll hold." Marcus saw Trevor's hand move to his belt, fingers brushing the canister of pepper spray. The guard was nervous, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between Marcus and his manager, as if seeking approval for violence not yet committed but already imagined. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said quietly, looking at Trevor rather than Hammond. "You know I haven't done anything wrong." For just a moment, a fraction of a second, something uncertain flickered in the young guard's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition that they'd crossed a line from security work into something else entirely. But then Hammond glanced at him, and Trevor's face hardened again. The brief crack in his certainty sealed over with obedience. "Put your hands where I can see them," Trevor said, his voice louder now, performing for the crowd. Marcus slowly removed his hands from his pockets, held them loosely at his sides. He didn't raise them, that felt like surrender, like accepting guilt for crimes he hadn't committed. But he made them visible because he knew how quickly situations like this could turn deadly for men who looked like him. "He's reaching for something," a man from the crowd shouted, and Marcus froze. "I'm not reaching for anything," he said, keeping his voice level despite the surge of adrenaline. "My hands are empty. You can see they're empty." But fear, once planted, grew like weeds. The crowd pulled back. A woman gasped. Trevor's hand closed around the pepper spray, began to draw it from his belt. "Don't move!" the guard shouted, though Marcus wasn't moving. "I'm not. I said don't move." Time seemed to slow. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the cold October air against his face, could see every detail with crystalline clarity. The way Trevor's fingers trembled slightly on the pepper spray canister, the satisfied righteousness in Hammond's expression, the mixture of fear and excitement in the watching crowd's faces, as if they were witnessing something dangerous being safely neutralized. And through the hotel's glass doors, he could see more faces pressed against the window, hotel staff and guests drawn by the commotion, all watching a black man in a worn coat being treated like a threat to civilization itself. "Police are on their way," Hammond announced, his tone victorious. "I suggest you stay very still until they arrive." Marcus stayed still, not because Hammond had suggested it, but because he'd learned long ago that stillness was sometimes the only form of protest that didn't get you killed. So he stood, hands at his sides, breathing slowly, while around him people whispered and filmed on their phones and made assumptions about his character, his history, his intentions, his humanity. A young woman in the crowd, early 20s, wearing a college sweatshirt, caught his eye. She wasn't filming, wasn't whispering, just watching with something that might have been empathy or might have been pity. Marcus held her gaze for a moment, and he saw her mouth open slightly, as if she might say something, might object to what was happening. But then her companion, a young man in expensive sneakers, tugged her arm, pulled her back into the safety of silence. "This is disgraceful," Mrs. Ashworth said, her voice carrying clearly across the sidewalk. "In my day, people like this knew their place. They didn't try to infiltrate decent establishments. People like this." Marcus turned his head slowly to look at her, and she flinched back as if he'd lunged at her. "What kind of people is that, exactly? Don't you dare speak to her." Hammond stepped forward, placing himself between Marcus and the woman. "You've done enough. Just shut your mouth and wait for the police." "I'm asking a genuine question," Marcus said, still looking at Mrs. Ashworth. "What kind of person am I, based on what you've observed in the last 10 minutes? She lifted her chin, diamonds catching the light. "You're clearly homeless, probably on drugs, definitely looking for trouble or a handout. And given your attitude, I'd say you're lucky we're calling the police instead of handling this ourselves." "My attitude?" Marcus almost smiled. "Almost. Ma'am, I've been standing quietly on a sidewalk. I haven't asked anyone for anything, haven't threatened anyone, haven't even raised my voice. But somehow I'm the problem." "You're the one refusing to leave," Hammond interjected. "Because I have every right to be here." "Rights?" Hammond's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You want to talk about rights? How about our guests' right to feel safe? Their right to enjoy their evening without being accosted by someone who, let's be honest, clearly doesn't belong in this neighborhood." There it was. The truth beneath the protocol, the real reason Marcus was being threatened with arrest and pepper spray and police violence. Not because of anything he'd done, but because of what he represented to people like Hammond and Mrs. Ashworth and everyone filming this confrontation for social media. A disruption in the natural order. A reminder of inequality made visible. A black man refusing to accept his assigned place in their hierarchy. The wail of sirens approached, growing louder. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He'd seen this movie before, knew how it could end. A black man, surrounded by white witnesses claiming he'd been aggressive, refusing to comply, reaching for something. The math was simple and often deadly. 2 police cars pulled up to the curb, lights flashing red and blue against the hotel's limestone facade. 4 officers emerged, hands resting casually on their belts, eyes already scanning, assessing, categorizing. "That's him," Hammond said immediately, pointing at Marcus. "He's been harassing our guests and refusing to leave the premises." The lead officer, A white man in his 40s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent too many years seeing the worst of humanity, walked over to Marcus with the slow, deliberate pace of someone in complete control. "What's going on here, sir?" The word sir was pro forma, empty of respect. "I'm standing on a public sidewalk," Marcus said quietly. "That's all." "That's not all," Hammond interrupted. "He's been loitering for over an hour, making threatening gestures, verbally harassing guests." "I haven't harassed anyone," Marcus said, keeping his eyes on the officer. "I've been standing here, that's all. I haven't asked anyone for money, haven't touched anyone, haven't threatened anyone." The officer looked Marcus up and down, taking in the worn coat, the old jeans, the scuffed boots. Marcus could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the snap judgment forming. "You got ID?" the officer asked. "Yes." "Let me see it." Slowly, Marcus reached slowly into his coat's inner pocket, moving with the exaggerated care of someone who understood that sudden movements could be interpreted as aggression. His fingers closed around his wallet, worn leather, held together with duct tape at one corner, and he pulled it out, opened it, extracted his driver's license. The officer took it, studied it with a flashlight. "Marcus Webb, this your current address?" "Yes." "Long way from home, aren't you?" "Not really." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You being smart with me?" "No, sir. Just answering your question." "He's definitely on something," Trevor volunteered. "You can see it in his eyes." Marcus turned his head to look at the security guard, and for the first time that evening, he let some of what he was feeling show on his face. Not anger, he kept that lock down tight, but something colder. Contempt, perhaps, or just exhaustion at the sheer repetitive stupidity of it all. "I'm not on anything," he said. "I'll take any test you want to give me." "Nobody's testing you," the officer said. "But I am going to need you to move along. The hotel management has asked you to leave, and you're required to comply." "I'm on a public sidewalk." "You're loitering." "Standing isn't loitering. It is when you're doing it with intent to panhandle or intimidate." "I haven't done either of those things." The officer stepped closer, his voice dropping lower. "Look, I don't know what your situation is, and I don't really care. But you need to move along right now, or I'm taking you in for trespassing and disorderly conduct." "Your choice." Marcus looked at the officer, then at Hammond, then at Trevor, then at the crowd of well-dressed people watching with their phones out, documenting this moment, this humiliation, this exercise in casual, comfortable cruelty. He thought about complying, about walking away, about preserving what remained of his dignity by removing himself from a situation designed to strip him of it. But then he thought about all the times he'd walked away, all the times he'd smiled and nodded and made himself smaller to make other people comfortable. All the indignities absorbed in silence because speaking up would only make things worse. "No," he said quietly. The officer's expression hardened. "Excuse me?" "No. I'm not leaving. I haven't broken any laws. I have every right to stand here." "That's it." The officer grabbed his radio. "I need a paddy wagon at 5th and Ashland. We've got one for trespassing and resisting." "I'm not resisting anything. I'm just not leaving." "Same thing." The officer moved behind Marcus, and Marcus felt hands on his wrists, felt cold metal closing around them. The click of handcuffs was loud in the sudden silence. "You're under arrest for criminal trespassing and disorderly conduct. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning continued, but Marcus barely heard it. He was focused on maintaining his composure, on not giving them the satisfaction of seeing him break. His wrists were pulled roughly behind his back, the metal biting into his skin. Someone from the crowd was definitely filming this. Good, he thought. Let them film it. Let there be evidence. "Is this really necessary?" A voice called out, the young woman in the college sweatshirt, finally finding her courage. "He wasn't doing anything wrong." "Stay out of this, miss," another officer said. "But he was just standing there." "I said stay out of it." The young man next to her pulled her back, whispered something urgent in her ear. She fell silent, her face flushed with shame or anger or both. "Thank you, officers," Hammond said, satisfaction rich in his voice. The last thing we need is this kind of element affecting our guest's experience. This kind of element, Marcus said, looking directly at Hammond. You know what's interesting? You've never asked me my name. Never asked what I was doing here. Never asked anything. You just looked at me and decided I was trash that needed removing. Because you were acting. I was standing. That's all. Everything else, the threat, the aggression, the danger, that was all in your head. You saw a black man in old clothes and decided he must be a criminal. This isn't about race, Hammond said quickly, too quickly. No. Marcus almost smiled. What's it about, then? My fashion choices. It's about protecting our guests and maintaining standards. Standards. Marcus looked around at the crowd, at their expensive clothes and jewelry, their manicured hands holding smartphones that cost more than some people made in a month. What standards are those exactly? The standard that says some people belong and others don't? That says you can judge a man's worth by his coat. Enough, the officer said, pushing Marcus toward the patrol car. You can philosophize from a jail cell. As they walked him toward the car, Marcus saw the lobby doors open again. A woman emerged, Sarah Chun, the Meridian Grand's head of operations. She was in her 50s, efficient and sharp-eyed, someone Marcus had worked with directly during the hotel's renovation and expansion. Someone who absolutely would recognize him if she looked closely. She was pulling on her coat, clearly heading home for the evening, when she noticed the commotion. Her eyes swept over the scene. The police cars, the crowd, the man in handcuffs being pushed toward a patrol car. Their eyes met. For a moment, nothing. Then her face went pale, her mouth falling open in horror. Wait! She shouted, running forward. Wait, stop. Oh my God! Stop! The officers paused, hands still on Marcus's arms. Hammond turned, irritation flickering across his face. Ms. Chun, this is under control. Under control? Her voice was shrill now, panicked. Do you have any idea who that is? Do you have any idea what you've done? Hammond blinked. He's a vagrant who? That's Marcus Webb. She was breathing hard now, her face flushed. That's Marcus Webb. He owns this hotel, Jeffrey. He owns this entire building. He owns the land it's sitting on. He owns the parking structure. He owns, Jesus Christ, he owns half the block. The silence that followed was absolute and total. Even the traffic seemed to quiet. Hammond's face went from irritation to confusion to slowly dawning horror, the color draining from his cheeks like water from a broken glass. That can't be. His voice was barely a whisper. Take the handcuffs off him right now, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Right now, or I swear to God, the lawsuits will bury every single one of you. The officers looked at each other. The lead officer looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite recognition, but a sudden terrible uncertainty. Sir, is this true? He asked. Marcus met his eyes steadily. Yes. You own this hotel. Yes. Why didn't you say something? I did. Several times. No one was interested in listening. The officer's hand moved to his keys, fumbled them, nearly dropped them. I'm going to remove these handcuffs now, sir. I'm very sorry about the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding, Marcus repeated softly as the metal clicked open and fell away from his wrists. He rubbed the red marks on his skin, deep impressions that would bruise by morning. Is that what we're calling it? Sarah had reached them now, her face a mixture of horror and fury. Mr. Webb, I am so sorry. I don't know what to say. I can't even. Ms. Chun. Marcus's voice was quiet but not unkind. I assume you were heading home for the evening? I was, but then you weren't part of this. You don't need to apologize. He turned to face Hammond, who looked like he might be sick. The general manager's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. His face a fascinating study in horror and disbelief, and the desperate scrambling of a man watching his career crumble in real time. Mr. Webb, Hammond finally managed, his voice strangled. I had no idea. If I'd known. If you'd known, you would have treated me differently, Marcus finished. Because ownership matters. Money matters. Status matters. But basic human dignity? That's apparently conditional. No, I just meant. I know what you meant. Marcus's voice was still calm, but now there was an edge to it, sharp as broken glass. You meant that if you'd known I was someone important, you wouldn't have treated me like trash. But the problem, Mr. Hammond, isn't that you mistreated someone important. The problem is that you think it's acceptable to treat anyone that way. Hammond's mouth worked silently. The crowd, which had been so vocal before, was now utterly silent. Everyone understanding they'd witnessed something that couldn't be unwatched, participated in something that couldn't be undone. Trevor, Marcus said, turning to the security guard, who looked like he wanted to sink into the pavement. You told me there was a shelter on Jefferson that serves dinner until 8. Have you ever been inside that shelter? The guard shook his head mutely. I have. I've been inside it hundreds of times. I donated the building. I fund it. I know the director by name, and I know at least 40 of the people who sleep there regularly. So when you suggested I go there, you weren't trying to help me. You were trying to remove me, to make me someone else's problem. Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't know. No, you didn't, and you didn't care to know. You saw what you expected to see. Marcus looked at the officers next. Officers, I won't be pressing charges. Not against the hotel staff and not against you. But I want your badge numbers. And I want the body camera footage from this interaction preserved. All of it. The lead officer swallowed hard. Of course, sir. Whatever you need. What I need, Marcus said quietly, is for people to stop treating human beings like garbage just because they don't look wealthy. But I don't expect that today. So badge numbers will have to do. He turned back to Hammond, who was visibly trembling now. Jeffrey, I believe we need to have a conversation. In my office, which, if you remember, is on the 18th floor. Your office? Yes, my office. In my building, where I sometimes work. Usually late at night, which is why you've probably never seen me there. Marcus pulled his phone from his pocket. An old model, screen cracked in one corner, and checked the time. It's 7:47. Let's call it 8 o'clock. I need to make a phone call first. He walked toward the hotel entrance, and the crowd parted like water, people stumbling over themselves to get out of his way. The doorman, who'd been standing frozen throughout the entire confrontation, quickly pulled open the door, his face stricken. Mr. Webb, I'm so sorry. I didn't recognize. It's all right, James, Marcus said, and the doorman's eyes widened at being addressed by name. You weren't part of this. As Marcus crossed the lobby, hotel staff and guests alike stared. Some looked confused. Others, who'd been watching through the windows, looked horrified. A few pulled out their phones, clearly Googling his name, their expressions shifting as they discovered who he actually was. Sarah Chun hurried after him. Mr. Webb, please, let me explain. Miss Chun, you don't need to explain anything. You weren't there. But I do need you to do something for me. Anything. I need you to pull the security footage from the last 90 minutes. Everything from the front entrance cameras, the lobby cameras, anything that shows what just happened. Preserve it. Make copies. I want everything documented. Of course. Right away. She paused. What are you going to do? Marcus pressed the elevator button. I'm going to make some changes. The elevator was empty. Guests who'd entered before him quickly found reasons to take the stairs. Marcus rode up alone, watching the floor numbers climb, his reflection in the polished brass doors. He looked tired, old though he was only 47. The marks on his wrists were darkening already, purple blooming under brown skin. The 18th floor was quiet, the executive offices dark except for emergency lighting. Marcus's office was at the end of the hall, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city he'd worked so hard to build equity in. He unlocked the door with a key from his worn wallet and stepped inside. The office was exactly as he'd left it 3 days ago. Clean, spare, expensive in its simplicity. A desk made from reclaimed wood. Chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Photographs on the walls, buildings he'd developed, neighborhoods he'd helped revitalize, projects that bore his name in small bronze plaques that most people never noticed. And on his desk, a single framed photograph. A woman and a teenage boy, both smiling, both gone. Marcus sat heavily in his chair and looked at the photograph for a long time. Sarah. His Sarah. Not the Chun woman downstairs, but his wife. And Marcus Jr., their son. Gone 6 years now, taken by a drunk driver on a Tuesday evening. Their car struck head-on while coming home from a basketball game. He'd been wealthy before they died. Successful, comfortable, proud of what he'd built. After they died, the money had felt like an obscenity. What was the point of owning buildings if the people you loved weren't alive to live in them? What was the point of wealth if it couldn't buy back time, couldn't resurrect the dead, couldn't fill the screaming void they'd left behind? He'd considered giving it all away. Had started to, actually, setting up foundations and scholarships and endowments. But his lawyer had talked him down, helped him see that he could do more good by maintaining his empire and using its profits for change than by liquidating everything in a fit of grief. So he'd kept the buildings, the hotels, the properties, kept working, but he'd stopped caring about looking the part. Stopped wearing suits that cost thousands of dollars. Stopped driving cars that cost more than houses. Started wearing his old clothes, the coat he'd bought when he had nothing, the jeans he'd worn while working construction, the boots that had carried him through his hardest years. It was a reminder of where he'd come from, of what mattered, of the fact that dignity and worth weren't measured in thread count or leather quality. But it also made him invisible to people like Hammond, made him suspect to people like Trevor, made him a threat to people like Mrs. Ashworth, made him, in short, just another black man in America. His phone rang. He glanced at the screen. David Rosen, his attorney. Word traveled fast. Hello, David. Marcus, what the hell happened? I'm getting calls from 3 different people saying you were arrested at your own hotel. Almost arrested. It didn't quite get that far. Jesus Christ. Are you all right? I'm fine. You don't sound fine. Marcus was silent for a moment. I'm tired, David. Of course you're tired. You were just publicly humiliated and almost arrested. Have you called your doctor? Are you hurt? Not physically. Another pause. You want me to come down there? No. But I do need you to do something. I need you to draft immediate dismissal papers for Jeffrey Hammond. Termination for cause, effective immediately. No severance beyond what's contractually required. The general manager? What did he do? He orchestrated my attempted arrest, called me a vagrant, told the police I was aggressive and probably on drugs. All without ever asking my name or why I was there. David swore softly. I'll have the papers ready by morning. What about the security guard? Trevor Johnson. Same thing. Termination for cause. Done. You want to go after the police? No. They were responding to a call. They didn't know. Though I do want their body camera footage preserved and reviewed. I'll make sure of it. Marcus, I have to ask. Why were you standing outside the hotel dressed like the way you were dressed? Like a poor person? I wouldn't put it that way. But that's what you mean. Marcus rubbed his eyes. I was there because I like standing there sometimes. Because I built that place. Because I like watching people enjoy something I created. And I dress this way because I choose to. Because these clothes are comfortable. Because they remind me of who I am, not what I own. Okay. But you have to understand how it looks. David, if I have to dress like a wealthy man to be treated like a human being, then the problem isn't my clothes. It's everyone else. David sighed. You're right. You're absolutely right. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. Just handle the paperwork. And David, I'm going to be making some changes. Big ones. We'll talk tomorrow. He hung up and sat in the darkness, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere down there, Hammond and Trevor were probably panicking, calling their own lawyers, trying to figure out how to salvage careers that were already over. Somewhere, people were posting the videos from tonight online, the story already going viral. Billionaire investor mistaken for homeless man, arrested at his own hotel. By morning, it would be everywhere. The think pieces would write themselves. Some would defend him. Some would criticize him for not identifying himself sooner, for playing games. Some would miss the point entirely. But some, maybe hopefully some, would understand. A knock at the door. Marcus turned to see Hammond standing in the doorway, looking 10 years older than he had an hour ago. His face gray in the dim light. "Mr. Webb, may I come in?" Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. Hammond sat down carefully, perched on the edge of the seat like a man afraid to get comfortable. "I don't know where to begin," Hammond said, his voice hoarse. "I've spent the last hour trying to figure out what to say, and I still don't know. I'm sorry seems completely inadequate." "It is," Marcus agreed. "I made a terrible mistake. Multiple mistakes. I judged you based on your appearance, and I treated you in a way that was unprofessional, disrespectful, and frankly cruel. I can't excuse it. I can only tell you that I'm deeply, profoundly sorry." Marcus studied the other man's face. The genuine distress there, the shame, the fear. "Jeffrey, do you understand why I'm going to fire you?" Hammond flinched but nodded. "Yes, sir. Tell me. I want to hear you say it. Because I treated you like you were less than human. Because I assumed the worst about you based on how you looked. Because I escalated a non-situation into a confrontation that could have ended with you being seriously hurt or killed. Because I abused my authority and failed to uphold the standards this hotel claims to represent." Hammond's voice cracked slightly. "Because I did to you what I would never have done to someone who looked wealthy or white." "That last part," Marcus said quietly, "that's the one that matters most. Because Jeffrey, you didn't just fail to recognize me. You failed to recognize my humanity. And you did it so automatically, so reflexively, that I don't think you even questioned it until Ms. Chun told you who I was." "You're right." Hammond's eyes were red-rimmed now. "You're absolutely right. And I don't know how to fix that about myself. But I swear to God I'm going to try." "That's good. I hope you do. But you're not going to do it here." Hammond nodded slowly, accepting the inevitable. "Is there anything I can do? Anything at all to, I don't even know, to make some tiny portion of this right?" Marcus considered this. "Answer a question honestly. If you'd known I was the owner from the start, how would you have treated me?" "I would have welcomed you, asked if you needed anything, made sure you were comfortable." "Exactly. You would have treated me with respect, with dignity, with basic human courtesy. Now answer this. Why shouldn't every person, regardless of who they are or what they own, receive that same treatment?" Hammond opened his mouth, closed it. No answer came. "That's the question I want you to sit with," Marcus said. "Not how you can get your job back or repair your reputation, but why you think dignity is something that has to be earned through wealth or status rather than something inherent to being human." "I'll do that, sir. I promise." Hammond stood slowly. "For what it's worth, you've been the best owner I've ever worked for. You've invested in this place, in the staff, in the community. You've never asked us to cut corners or squeeze out extra profit at the expense of quality or people. And I repaid that by treating you like trash." His voice broke. "I'm so sorry, Jeffrey." Marcus waited until the other man met his eyes. "I accept your apology. Not because what you did was okay, but because I believe you mean it. And I hope you take this lesson forward. I hope you become the kind of person who treats everyone, with the respect you showed me once you knew my name." After Hammond left, Marcus sat alone in his office for a long time, thinking about the evening's events and what they meant. Eventually, he pulled out his phone and began making calls. First to the heads of his other properties, 12 hotels across 6 cities, and then to the boards of the various foundations and charities he funded. By midnight, the plan was in place. The changes came swiftly. Within 48 hours, every property Marcus owned had implemented new policies. Mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, developed in partnership with civil rights organizations. New protocols for addressing complaints that required verification before action. Plainclothes audits to test how staff treated people who appeared homeless or poor. And substantial penalties for discrimination of any kind. But Marcus didn't stop there. He established a fund, $10 million, to be distributed to organizations fighting homelessness and poverty. Another fund to provide legal defense for people wrongfully accused or arrested due to racial profiling. Scholarships for young black men pursuing careers in business and real estate, named after his son. The hotel itself was transformed. The lobby now featured a large bronze plaque that read, "Every person who enters here deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. We commit to treating all people as we would wish to be treated." And every Monday evening, the Meridian Grand opened its doors to the community. Free meals served in the ballroom for anyone who needed them. No questions asked, no judgment rendered. The staff who'd watched Marcus's humiliation now served the same people they might once have turned away. And in their eyes, slowly, grudgingly at first and then more genuinely, understanding grew. Trevor, the security guard, took his termination hard. But 3 weeks later, he showed up at the Monday community dinner, not as staff but as a volunteer. He sought out Marcus, who was there helping serve, and apologized again. This time without the desperation of someone trying to save his job, but with the humility of someone who genuinely learned. "I keep thinking about that night," Trevor said, his voice rough. "Keep seeing your face when I told you to go to the shelter. The way you stayed so calm while I treated you like that. And I realized that wasn't the first time. Was it? That wasn't the first time someone did that to you." "No," Marcus said quietly. "It wasn't. How do you stand it? How do you not just explode?" Marcus looked at the young man. Younger than he'd seemed that night, maybe 25, scared and ashamed and trying to be better. Because exploding would give people like Jeffrey Hammond an excuse to say they were right about me. Because staying calm is the only way to make people see their own behavior clearly. And because anger, real anger, is exhausting. I'd rather save my energy for building something better. Trevor nodded slowly. "I'm going to do better. I'm taking classes. Not just the training your foundation paid for, but real classes. About bias and psychology and history. Because I don't want to be that person again. I don't want to see a man standing on a sidewalk and immediately think he's a threat." "That's good," Marcus said. "That's how change happens. One person at a time deciding to be better." The young woman from that night, the one in the college sweatshirt who'd almost spoken up, came to one of the community dinners too. She'd written Marcus a letter, apologizing for her silence, explaining that she'd broken up with the boyfriend who'd pulled her back, that she'd spent 3 weeks crying and thinking about what she'd witnessed. "I tell myself I'm not racist," she told Marcus, her eyes red. "I tell myself I'd stand up to injustice. But when the moment came, I didn't. I was scared of making a scene, of being wrong, of being embarrassed. And while I stood there being scared, you were being treated like you weren't even human. But you're here now," Marcus said. "That matters. Does it? Does showing up weeks later actually change anything? It changes you. And yes, that matters. Because the next time you see someone being treated unjustly, you'll remember this feeling. And maybe you'll find your voice a little sooner." Mrs. Ashworth, the woman with the diamonds who'd spoken so dismissively of people like this, never apologized. But Marcus heard through the social networks of the wealthy that she'd been quietly disinvited from several charity boards, that people no longer wanted to be associated with someone who'd been so publicly, obviously racist. Her reputation, built over decades, had crumbled in a single evening because someone had filmed her ugly words and shared them with the world. Marcus didn't take pleasure in it. If anything, he felt a kind of sad pity. She was old enough that she probably wouldn't change, wouldn't learn, wouldn't grow. She'd just retreat further into her prejudices, convinced she was the victim, that the world had become too sensitive, that she'd done nothing wrong. Some people, Marcus had learned, would never understand, and that was their loss. 6 months after that October evening, Marcus stood once again outside the Meridian Grand, wearing the same worn coat, the same old jeans, the same scuffed boots. But this time, when guests passed him, some nodded. Some smiled. Some even stopped to talk, recognizing him from the news coverage or from the Monday dinners. The new general manager, a woman named Patricia Morrison who'd previously managed one of his Chicago properties, came out to stand beside him. "Checking up on us?" she asked with a slight smile. "Just watching," Marcus said. "It's peaceful here at this time of evening." It is. She was quiet for a moment. You know, when you offered me this position, I thought it was going to be impossible. Following Jeffrey after everything that happened. But the staff, they wanted to do better. They wanted to prove they could be better. Some of them, anyway. The ones who couldn't adapt didn't last long. Good. I had someone from corporate come by last week. Wanted to know if all these new policies were hurting business. If being too inclusive was driving away the wealthy clientele. Marcus turned to look at her. What did you tell them? I told them revenue is up 18%. I told them our guest satisfaction scores have never been higher. I told them our staff retention has improved dramatically. And then I told them that even if none of those things were true, we'd still be doing it because it's the right thing to do. Marcus smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. That's why I hired you. A young black man in a hoodie walked past, glanced at the hotel, then kept going. Marcus watched him, remembering himself at that age. Hungry, ambitious, invisible to most of the world. He wondered what that young man saw when he looked at the Meridian Grand. Did he see a place that would welcome him? Or did he see just another fortress of wealth that would turn him away at the door? Patricia, Marcus said, I want you to do something for me. That young man who just walked by, follow him. Give him this. He pulled a business card from his wallet and handed it to her. Tell him if he's looking for work, we're hiring. Tell him we judge people by their character and work ethic, not their wardrobe. Patricia took the card, nodded, and hurried after the young man. Marcus watched her catch up to him, saw the young man's suspicious expression soften into surprise, saw him take the card and study it like it might disappear if he blinked. Maybe he'd come in tomorrow. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he'd think it was a trick or a joke. But maybe he'd walk through those doors and be treated like a human being worthy of respect. And maybe that would change something in him, make him believe the world could be different than he'd been taught to expect. Small changes, individual moments, but enough of them, strung together like lights on a wire, and eventually you could illuminate the darkness. Marcus pulled his coat tighter against the October chill and smiled. The story of that evening spread far beyond the immediate witnesses. It became a case study in business schools about the dangers of unconscious bias. It became a training tool for police departments about the importance of de-escalation and not making assumptions. It became a sermon topic in churches, a discussion prompt in classrooms, a viral moment that sparked countless conversations about race, class, dignity, and power. But for Marcus, it remained deeply personal. It was a reminder that no amount of wealth or success could shield him from being seen as threatening simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. That his son, if he'd lived, would have grown up to face the same assumptions, the same dangers, the same exhausting requirement to prove his humanity over and over again. Yet it was also a reminder of something else. That change was possible. That people could learn. That institutions could transform. That the arc of justice, while long, could be bent by those willing to push against it with enough force and conviction. On the anniversary of that October evening, Marcus held a ceremony at the hotel. Not a celebration, he didn't feel like celebrating, but a remembrance. He invited everyone who'd been there that night. Trevor and Patricia and Sarah Chen. The officers who'd nearly arrested him. The young woman who'd broken up with her boyfriend. Even Jeffrey Hammond, who came looking frail and older, no longer working in hospitality but teaching now, trying to pass along the lessons he'd learned too late. They gathered in the ballroom, 100 people who'd witnessed or participated in that moment of crystallized injustice. And Marcus stood before them and spoke. A year ago tonight, I stood outside this building and was treated like I had no right to exist in this space. I was threatened, handcuffed, humiliated, not because of anything I'd done, but because of who you thought I was based on what I looked like. And many of you watched it happen. Some of you participated. Some of you filmed it. And a few of you questioned it, though not loudly enough to stop it. I could spend this evening angry. Lord knows I have the right. But anger, while sometimes necessary, rarely builds anything lasting. So instead, I want to talk about what we've built here in the past year. We've created policies that protect dignity. We've trained staff to see people, not stereotypes. We've opened our doors to those who need them. We've hired people who might have been turned away elsewhere. We've become, I hope, a place where a man in a worn coat can stand outside without fearing for his safety or his freedom. But this isn't about one hotel. It's not even about one industry. It's about every space where power and prejudice intersect. Where someone's assumptions about another person's worth can determine whether they're welcomed or ejected, believed or doubted, respected or degraded. Each of you has power in your own sphere. Some of you hire people. Some of you make policy. Some of you simply witness injustice and have to decide whether to speak up or stay silent. And what I want you to take from this evening is simple. Use your power to expand dignity, not restrict it. Assume the best of people until they prove otherwise. And remember that every person you encounter is someone's son or daughter, someone's parent or child, someone worthy of the same respect you'd want for yourself or your loved ones. That's all. That's the whole lesson. Treat people like they're human. It sounds simple, but as we all learned a year ago, it's the hardest and most important thing we can do. The room was silent when he finished. Then Trevor stood, and after a moment's hesitation, began to clap. Others joined, slow at first, then building until the entire room was applauding. Not for Marcus, but for the idea he represented. For the possibility of change. For the hope that people could learn and grow and become better versions of themselves. After the ceremony, as people mingled and ate and told their own stories of transformation, Marcus slipped out to his usual spot on the sidewalk. The November air was cold, promising snow, and he pulled his worn coat tighter. The same coat never replaced because it still served its purpose. Patricia found him there 10 minutes later. You know, one of these days you're gonna have to buy a new coat. That one's barely holding together. It's fine, Marcus said. Keeps me warm. That's all a coat needs to do. Is it, though? You could afford a coat that would keep you warmer. One that didn't have duct tape at the seams. Marcus looked at her. This woman who'd worked for him for 3 years now and still didn't quite understand. Patricia, the coat isn't about money or warmth. It's a reminder. Every time I put it on, I remember what it felt like to have nothing. To be invisible. To be judged and found wanting based on appearance alone. And as long as I remember that, I can't become the kind of person who forgets what it's like to be powerless. She nodded slowly. You're afraid of becoming Jeffrey Hammond. No. I'm afraid of becoming the person I was before that night. Someone who thought he understood injustice but had never felt its full weight. That evening, in handcuffs, being told I was probably on drugs while a crowd filmed my humiliation. That was a gift, Patricia. Terrible, painful gift. It stripped away any illusion I had that success or wealth could protect me from being seen as less than human. Some gift. The best ones usually hurt. He looked up at the hotel, its windows glowing gold against the dark sky. You know what I think about sometimes? All the people who've been treated the way I was but who didn't have the power to change anything afterward. Who were arrested or beaten or worse and no one ever knew their names. Who couldn't hold anyone accountable because they weren't secretly wealthy. They were just people, trying to exist, and the world ground them down for it. You can't save everyone. No. But I can remember them, and I can make sure that here, in this place, their dignity is honored even if their names are unknown. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the city move around them. A police car passed, slowed, the officer inside glancing at Marcus before driving on. Marcus wondered if it was one of the officers from that night, if they recognized him, if they ever thought about what had almost happened. You should head home, Patricia said eventually. It's getting cold. In a minute. But he stood there for another hour, wearing his worn coat like armor, watching people pass, reminding himself with every shiver that comfort was a privilege and memory was a responsibility. The lesson, Marcus reflected, wasn't just for the Jeffrey Hammonds or Trevor Johnsons of the world. It was for him too. Success and wealth could insulate you from so much, but they could also blind you to the struggles of those still fighting battles you'd forgotten you'd won. The coat kept him honest. The cold kept him remembering. The sidewalk kept him grounded in the reality that most people lived with every day, The reality that your worth as a human being was constantly being assessed by strangers who knew nothing about you except what they could see. And what they saw, more often than not, said more about their own prejudices than about your actual character. In the years that followed, Marcus continued his work. More hotels, more policies, more investments in communities that desperately needed them. He never did buy a new coat. When the old one finally gave out, the duct tape no longer sufficient to hold it together, he had it repaired, paying a seamstress to carefully mend every tear, preserving it the way archaeologists preserve ancient artifacts. Because that's what it was, in a way. An artifact of a moment when the world showed him its true face. When all his money and power and success meant nothing because he'd committed the crime of existing in a black body while looking poor. The world needed to remember that moment. And so did he. Years later, a journalist interviewing Marcus for a profile piece asked him why he still wore the coat, why he hadn't donated it to a museum or retired it as a symbol of that transformative night. Marcus considered the question carefully. Because the fight isn't over, he said finally. Because there are still Jeffrey Hammonds out there, and still people being judged by their appearance rather than their character. Because comfort makes you forget, and I can't afford to forget. None of us can. But you've done so much, the journalist pressed. You've changed policies, changed institutions. Surely you've earned the right to. To what? To stop remembering? To stop caring? Marcus shook his head. That's not how this works. The moment I take off this coat and put on something expensive, the moment I start believing my own press releases, that's when I become part of the problem instead of part of the solution. This coat is my accountability. It keeps me honest. The journalist scribbled notes, then looked up. What do you want people to take away from your story? That dignity isn't negotiable. That respect isn't something you earn through wealth or status. It's something owed to every human being simply because they're human. And that before you judge someone, before you assume you know who they are based on what they're wearing or where they're standing, remember that you might be looking at someone extraordinary. Or you might be looking at someone ordinary who deserves extraordinary respect anyway. Because there's no difference. There shouldn't be a difference. That's a nice sentiment, the journalist said. But do you really think people can change? Do you think prejudices ingrained over lifetimes can be unlearned? Marcus thought about Trevor, who now directed a nonprofit helping formerly incarcerated people find employment. About Jeffrey Hammond, who taught courses on unconscious bias and inclusive management. About the young woman in the college sweatshirt who'd gone to law school and now worked for the ACLU. About the countless staff members at his hotels who'd confronted their own assumptions and emerged better for it. I think people can surprise you, he said. I think the capacity for change is one of humanity's most underestimated qualities. Will everyone change? No. Some people are too comfortable in their prejudices, too invested in their worldview to examine it honestly. But enough people can change and do change that progress becomes possible. Slow, frustrating, uneven progress, but progress nonetheless. And the coat, Marcus smiled. The coat is my reminder that I'm not done yet. That none of us are done yet. That every time we think we've solved the problem, there's another Jeffrey Hammond learning the wrong lessons, another security guard seeing threats instead of people, another crowd filming humiliation instead of preventing it. So I keep the coat, and I keep standing on sidewalks, and I keep remembering that dignity isn't something you can buy or own or control. It's something you choose to honor in others or choose to deny. And that choice, made over and over by millions of people every day, determines what kind of world we live in. The journalist closed her notebook. For what it's worth, I think what you're doing matters. Not just the policies or the foundations, but this, the remembering, the refusing to forget. Thank you, Marcus said. But it's not worth much if only one person does it. The world needs thousands of people like me, wearing their worn coats, remembering their humiliations, using their power to prevent others from experiencing the same. That's when real change happens. When it's not one man's story but everyone's commitment. After the journalist left, Marcus returned to his familiar spot outside the Meridian Grand. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. People passed. Some who recognized him, some who didn't, all received with the same neutral presence. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, walked by with his mother. He stared at Marcus with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood. "Mama," he said, not quite whispering, "why is that man just standing there?" The mother glanced at Marcus, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or just the practiced wariness of someone who'd learned to assess situations quickly. "He's just watching the sunset, baby. Sometimes people like to do that. Can we watch too?" She hesitated, then nodded. They stood a few feet away from Marcus, the three of them silent, watching the day drain from the sky. "It's pretty," the boy said eventually. "Yes," Marcus agreed. "It is. Do you stand here every day?" "Not every day, but often." "Why?" Marcus looked at the child, too young to understand the full story, but old enough to learn its most important lesson. "Because this is a good spot to remember things, to think about what matters." "What matters?" The mother shot Marcus an apologetic look, but he waved it off. Good questions deserved good answers. "Treating people kindly matters," Marcus said. "Seeing people for who they really are, not what you think they are, matters. Standing up when something's wrong matters. And remembering, really remembering, the times you got it wrong so you can do better next time. That matters most of all." The boy considered this with the seriousness children bring to things adults have learned to take lightly. "I'll try to remember," he said. "Good. That's all any of us can do." The mother smiled at Marcus, genuine warmth in it, and took her son's hand. "Come on, baby. Let's go home." They walked away, and Marcus returned his attention to the sunset, now fading to deep purple at the edges. Soon it would be night. Soon the hotel would light up completely, a beacon of warmth and welcome. Soon he'd go inside, ride the elevator to the 18th floor, and sit in his office looking at the photograph of his wife and son. But for now, he stood in his worn coat on a public sidewalk, a black man mistaken for nothing he was and everything he'd once been, remembering the night he'd been stripped of dignity and choosing to transform that humiliation into something that might, somehow, make the world incrementally better. Because that's what you did with pain, if you were lucky and strong enough to survive it. You turned it into purpose. You turned it into change. You turned it into a worn coat you refused to replace. A reminder worn close to the skin that dignity was fragile and precious and demanded constant protection. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who'd never have the power to demand it back once it was taken away. The streetlights flickered on, and Marcus Webb stood beneath them. A man who owned buildings but wore poverty like a shield, who possessed wealth but chose remembrance over comfort, who understood that the greatest privilege of power was using it to ensure others never had to fight as hard as he had for the simple recognition of their humanity. He would stand here again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, watching, remembering, refusing to forget. Because the moment you forget how easily dignity can be stripped away is the moment you become someone capable of stripping it from others. And Marcus Webb had been on the wrong end of that equation enough times to know that some coats, worn, frayed, held together with duct tape and determination, were worth more than any amount of cashmere or wool. They were worth the weight of remembering, worth the cold, worth the questions from strangers and the discomfort of choosing difficulty over ease. Worth, in the end, being the kind of man who would rather freeze in an old coat than warm himself with the amnesia of privilege. The night deepened, the city hummed, and Marcus Webb stood witness to both. A keeper of difficult truths, a guardian of hard-won lessons, a man who understood that justice wasn't a destination but a practice. Daily, difficult, demanding, and absolutely essential. Never judge a man by his appearance, especially when silence hides power. But more than that, never judge a man by his appearance at all, because every person standing on every sidewalk carries stories you cannot see, dignity you cannot measure, and humanity you have no right to question. The coat doesn't make the man. The assumptions don't define the truth. And the only test that matters is whether you can look at another human being, any human being, and choose to honor their worth before you know their name. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's what Marcus Webb stood for, in his worn coat, on his cold sidewalk, under his golden lights. And that's what the world needed to learn, one humiliation, one revelation, one transformation at a time.